How much did we say prior to the recording? Do you know? I don't know. Who knows? Perhaps I fell asleep. All right. Today we're going to talk about chapters 34 to 46. And in these chapters, we're going to remember the Cave of Montesinos and think a lot about simulation and dissimulation, reality and illusion, lying and telling the truth, error and falsity, and also presentation and representation. Because just as in the Cave of Montesinos, we have a divergence in perspectives. Sancho thinks that Don Quixote goes into a cave for 30 minutes to an hour. Don Quixote comes out from the cave with his eyes closed and claims that no sleep, those eyes are closed, eating or passing fluids or defecating happens in an enchanted land. And yet he was in this enchanted land of Montesinos, meeting Montesino and seeing Dulcinea enchanted for 3 days he claims. We will now today see a representation that is itself a fictionalized representation put on by the Duke and the Duchess, who we will meet at the end of the episode of the Water Wheels, which I will just briefly mention before really launching into things today. And they will themselves take Don Quixote and Sancho to their home. At their home, they will have all of their servants and household act as if Don Quixote is in fact a chivalric knight. And so they will put him through episode after episode of fictionalized experiences, including the Dolorous Dueñas, which we'll talk about, the Countess Trifaldi, and Antonomasia. I'll talk a little bit about these names and what they mean, and the increasingly fictionalized nature of this fiction. It is a fictional representation that becomes even more fictional as we go because of the interaction of so-called real characters like the Duke and the Duchess with the literary character Don Quixote, whom they read about in the first part of the book, which is a part of the reality of the second part. Keep this in mind. The first part of Don Quixote, as well as the spurious second part by Avellaneda, are both books that exist within the second part of this Don Quixote. Books that have been read by the Duke and the Duchess. They've only read the actual first part. And so now they find themselves hosting whom they thought to be, or someone whom they thought to be a fictional character. And what better to do with this character than to put him through episodes that they have themselves constructed, fictions that they have constructed in order to amuse themselves. There's a class issue here too. The Duke and the Duchess are of high nobility. And so they are the leisure class, as it were. They spend a great deal of time attempting to entertain themselves. They go on the hunt. They have balls. They have huge, spectacular meals. And they have the resources necessary to entertain themselves. And so it is almost as if their very telos, their very goal in life is just to be entertained. And so they perhaps remind us a little bit of middle-class Americans from the 21st century in some ways too. Okay, I mentioned the Cave of Montesinos because of the dual perspectives that we have from Sancho and from Don Quixote. Remember, Sancho says, I do not believe that Don Quixote is lying about what he says in the Cave of Montesinos, but I don't believe that he's telling the truth. I think that he is mad. Even though, remember, Don Quixote says that he can prove it. Okay, we talked a little bit about Inés de Pasamonte and his prophetic monkey, which I'm very happy that we did. And then chapters 28 to 33, we have the adventure of the water wheels. This is very similar, I would say, to the adventure in the first part with the windmills. It is again a time when Don Quixote seems to see something which is not seen by Sancho. These are water mills that are used in a mill in order to produce the energy necessary to crush mill. You've seen these before. These are those wooden wheels that take water up and down, and very basic engineering. And so he attacks these, he injures them as well as himself, and then in conjunction with what he has been doing over and over again in part two, like when he restored to Inés de Pasamonte the money necessary to buy new puppets, or restored to the innkeeper the money that he had lost through striking down the giant Bruno, which was just 2 giant wine sacks. We have here again Don Quixote further impoverishing himself by paying back the damages to the millers who attempted to save Don Quixote and their wheels from Don Quixote. Chapter 30, Don Quixote and Sancho meet the Duke and the Duchess while they are hawking. This is another elite activity. I don't know if any of you are any of you hawkers or falconers. Do you know any hawkers? Anybody ever seen one of those falconeers with one of the large gloves? When I was in Italy, in Venice, I was eating at a hotel 2 years ago. And something you may know about Venice is that their birds, their seagulls, are vicious. And sometimes you'll even see their seagulls eating each other. On St. Mark's Square, for example, very famous flooding square. But I was once eating lunch with my wife, and we came out onto the terrace, and there was a man with a falcon. And at first, I'm like, what's the Italian word for falcon? Falco. And I was wondering why he was out there, but it didn't take very long because the seagulls will come. I mean, it's like if in New York, if you've ever been there, they'll come right up to you. And they'll try and steal your food off of your table, but not when the falcon was there. And yeah, falcon's a very useful way. So, perhaps if you're in a very populated place, have like a, scare falcon. But remember, like Sancho, that you don't want your scare falcon to be like the log that was put with the frogs, where they come to disdain it, and that which was supposed to oppress them, they end up sitting on top of. In any case, they are doing this. They are committed to this elite activity, and they meet Sancho and Don Quixote, and they are delighted. They are so delighted that they insist that they take Don Quixote and Sancho back to their home, where we will start to engage in spatial form. From chapters, I would say, what's it, about 45 to 53 or so, Sancho and Don Quixote are separated. Sancho is taken to his island, which is the walled inland city called Barataria. I'll talk about what the name means, something like cheaply gotten. And Don Quixote stays at the home of the Duke and the Duchess, and one of their maids, Altisidora, whose name itself means something like highest gift, attempts to seduce Don Quixote and to pull him away from Dulcinea. And so while Sancho and Don Quixote are separated, we get to really look at each of them without the other. And yet, something I think very sweet, especially to those of you who are really thinking about the relationship between Sancho and Don Quixote, is that they continue to come up in each other's minds, continue to talk about each other. And in fact, Don Quixote even sends a letter to Sancho, which of course Sancho can't read, but can have read for him. Okay. I said that I was going to give you some quotes and some interesting information. I don't give you exactly where they are because I apologize. I took this from a slightly different translation, which I didn't have page numbers on it because I'm using EPUB here. Sorry about EPUBs rather than PDFs. That's the most annoying thing about them. You know that about EPUBs? How you can't print EPUBs as well? Did you know that? It's not it's not the same sort of file as a PDF, and you need some sort of technical. Do any of you have the converting software that can turn an e-publication into a PDF? That's something I'm told you actually have to pay for, and is way more complicated than I thought. This is the sort of thing that you learn when you work in the gigs I work. Okay, remember, Cave of Montesinos, diverting perspectives. 30 minutes to an hour of just going down into a dingy cave, or a truly strange adventure for 3 days into a spectacular phantasmagoric space. Phantasmagoric. That means really fantastic space. Okay. Here's a quote. And I have a few quotes today. I would apologize, except for I think they're really, really good. Chapter 31. At length, the Duke came out to take her down, and as they entered the spacious court, 2 fair damsels came forward and threw over Don Quixote's shoulders a large mantle of the finest scarlet cloth. So the Duke, the Duchess, their procession from hawking, as well as Sancho and Don to treat Don Quixote as if he is a fictional chivalric knight. And so he is getting the sort of treatment that he has never gotten. Remember, everywhere he goes, he thinks that he's a chivalric knight, but he's somewhere like an inn with safe prostitutes who he calls fair ladies. They laugh at him. They tell him that he's wrong-minded. Here, he's treated very differently from anywhere before. The finest scarlet cloth, and at the same instant, all the galleries of the court were lined with the men servants and the women servants of the household crying, "Welcome, flower and cream of knights errantry," while all or most of them flung pellets filled with scented water over Don Quixote, not like when one is at a late night show and somebody throws their Bud Light all over somebody else. And the Duke and Duchess, at all which Don Quixote was greatly astonished. Greatly astonished. Why would he be astonished at this truth? This was the first time that he thoroughly felt and believed himself to be a knight errant in reality, and not merely in fancy, now that he saw himself treated in the way as he had read of such knights being treated in the days of yore. That is a very, very curious phrase. I'm not going to belabor it too much because we've been talking about this, and I leave it to you to know the value of gold when you see it. But I would look at this gold and try and evaluate whether it can help you at all. It's the first time that he thoroughly felt and believed himself to be a knight errant. This is the first time that he thoroughly felt and believed himself. In reality, not merely in fancy. Now that he saw himself treated in the same way as he had read of such knights being treated in days of yore, this breaks the question wide open of, did he ever think prior to this moment that he was truly a chivalric knight? Or was there some degree of that being an act? This is a question that I wish to raise with you today and to have risen in your head as you continue to write. So chapter 32, Don Quixote meets the ecclesiastic, who is the churchman who helps to run the affairs, and the Duke and the Duchess is home, make sure that nothing too untoward happens, though of course this giant farce is happening in their household, which he naturally is not a fan of. This might be seen, if one really wanted to be scholarly about this, as the sort of antipathy that exists at the time in the early 17th century between those who are ecclesiastics, those who are religious figures, priests, and those who are secular writers of fiction. There's a tension between what someone should spend his or her or their time reading. Should it be good, holy script, or should it be, this sort of mind-numbing, in the perspective of an ecclesiastic, false belief-causing tales about chivalric knights. A modern example of this might be like, should you spend your time watching documentaries about things which have happened, or Marvel comic movies? Marvel comic movies are probably the closest thing in our time to the chivalric romances, right? They're very simple. They're mostly made for young men, though there are more and more made for women. But the vast majority of them have male protagonists and male antagonists. For that matter, there we are. And they involve heroes who are very much not, who do not exist in reality and perhaps could not exist in reality, like say a Superman, or you think about Iron Man or Batman. Could somebody so vastly wealthy actually keep people from knowing that it was clearly them that was being a vigilante in the city? It's like, you're the one billionaire. All this stuff costs so much money. In any case, I say that to you now because isn't it now still the case that some people say that certain movies, shows, video games, music rots your brain? And you can decide whether you think some do, or some does, or some does not. But that is the sort of antipathy this ecclesiastic feels towards Don Quixote, and the sort of literature which Don Quixote represents. And in fact, it seems to have a case because this literature has led to Don Quixote going insane, and led to his Duke and the Duchess putting on this insane charade where they bring him into their house and continue to deceive him. Which does not seem like something, if I were a good, truth-loving ecclesiastic, that I would very much approve of. And so there is a certain, there is certainly a tension between the ecclesiastic and Don Quixote and what is happening to him. Okay, this is very important. Chapter 33. I'm just going to let it take as much time as it has to. This is where Sancho finally sits down and talks to the Duchess. And the Duchess wants to clear some things up with him that she read in part 1. Remember, she's read part 1, just like we have. So she knows that Sancho did not see Dulcinea. And so she knows what he thinks. Because she knows what he thinks, she can lie to him. She can change what he thinks. So here we go. Now, Senora, that I have seen that there is no one except the bystanders listening to us on the sly, I will. That's like if I were talking to one of you about your essay and one of you were like looking through the doors. Now that I can see that only one of you is listening on the sly, I feel that we can have a conversation. I will answer what you have asked me and all you may ask me without fear or dread. And the first thing I've got to say is that for my own part, this chapter 33 again, I don't have the page, I apologize. I hold my master Don Quixote to be stark mad. He holds him to be stark mad, okay? Though sometimes he says things that to my mind, and indeed everybody's that listens to him, are so wise and run in such a straight furrow that Satan himself could not have said them better. But for all that, really, and beyond all question, it's my firm belief he is cracked. You all know what that means to be cracked. There's a cracked magazine. They have a fractured mind. Oh yeah, by the way, the study of like skulls and your temperament, depending on your skull shape, did any of you look that up? Phrenologies. Which is really interesting because the phren was an organ that the ancient Greeks thought that you had near your heart. The phren is where we get the words frenzy, frenetic, frantic. You all know the meaning of these words, being a panic. And so it's a disorder of your phren. Yeah, well, that's interesting. Okay, so to be cracked means to have is to be like, and this is a good word, you should know the origin of this word, to be schizophrenic. Now you know what that means. The friend, schism in church is a split of one church into two. So the friend was an organ that the Greeks thought you could think with. So when you're frantic, it's like you're out of your mind. And so a schizophrenic, originally the idea was a split mind, which is a little, it's different now. And there is multiple personality disorder, which some people think is, a lot of people mistakenly think is what schizophrenia is. But in any case, to be cracked is sort of a vulgar, rude way of saying that somebody is has lost their integrity, which means their wholeness, and their mind is more like a sieve with holes in it than a unified whole. Because they're crazy. So he's crazy, is what Sancho is saying. Well then, as this is clear in my mind, I can venture to make him believe things that have neither head nor tail. Those are obviously fabulous things, fake things, like that affair of the answer to the letter, and that other of 6 or 8 days ago, which is not yet in history because it's the second part that hasn't been written down, supposedly. That is to say, the affair of the enchantment of my lady Dulcinea, for I made him believe she is enchanted, but there's no more truth in it than over the hills of Clubeda. That is very, very interesting. There's a little bit more. The Duchess then talks to Sancho about who is truly madder, the person who does not choose to be mad and leads, or the person who chooses to follow a mad leader. And I think that's a pretty good question. There are good reasons on either side. There's a version of a question, which is who is more damnable? The heretic who thinks that he is correct and creates schism and moves in one direction, or the people that follow the heretic and just believe in him? Well, at least ecclesiastically, theologically, it has often been the heretic himself. In fact, in Christian heresiology, usually heresies are named for the heresy. So like Arianism, for example, is named Arianism because Arian was the name of the heresy. So, but I don't want to read this quote. The next. Nope, this is the one on. I'm going to start in the middle though, because this is the Duchess responding. So I know, okay, for in truth and earnest, I know from good authority that the coarse country wench who jumped up on the ass was and is Dulcinea del Toboso, and that worthy Sancho, though he fancies himself the deceiver, is the one that is deceived. And that there is no more reason to doubt the truth of this than of anything else we never saw. Senor Sancho Panza must know too that we too have it, or must know that we too have enchanters here that are well disposed to us, and tell us what goes on in the world plainly and distinctly without subterfuge or deception. And believe me, Sancho, that agile country lass was and is Dulcinea del Toboso, who is as much enchanted as the mother that bore her. So let's try and lay this out in our heads really quickly. What we heard in the first part is that there was a peasant lass named Aldonza Lorenzo. Sancho seemed to have seen her before. He claimed that he had seen her making barley and meal, and that she had burly forearms. And so okay. But when he was sent by Don Quixote, not holding the letter he was supposed to take to her, he doesn't make it to see her. He is intercepted by the priest and the barber, who think, because he's on Rocinante, that he has killed and robbed Don Quixote. He explains to them the situation that he finds him in, and then sort of forgets the Dulcinea bit and works with the priest and the barber to come up with a plan to bring Don Quixote back in from the Sierra Morena and back home. In the beginning of part 2, when Sancho and Don Quixote have gone back together and are on their horses, or horse and the gray, the donkey, as well, they run into 3 peasant lasses. Sancho, in order to avoid a scolding, claims that one of them is the enchanted Dulcinea. She must have been enchanted to look like a peasant rather than a beautiful lady. This is not the same peasant as Aldonza Lorenzo. Don Quixote then, in the cave of Montesinos, claims that he sees the enchanted Dulcinea, and that this enchanted Dulcinea requires some measure, that there's something that must be done to take the enchantment off of her. Sancho then tells the Duchess that he himself lied about the fact that Dulcinea was enchanted. She says, no, Sancho, you did not lie. You may have thought that you were lying, but it is you who is deceived, because in fact, Dulcinea is enchanted. And why do I belabor that with you? Well, because then the Duke and the Duchess put on a phantasmagoric parade of their own. Phantasmagoric parade that is itself led by Merlin. Merlin, who dictates and says that Dulcinea can be disenchanted. Dulcinea can be disenchanted how? Dulcinea can be disenchanted only by the actions of one person, one man. Which man? Don Quixote, right? Wrong. Sancho. Why Sancho, do you think? Why would it be Sancho? Who came up with the fib in the first place? And so what is it that Sancho has to do? He has to take 3,300 lashes. And I think something that a lot of contemporary people don't necessarily know, because we aren't all accustomed to sting of a whip, is that something like, and there are different whips from different times, but one of the ones that gets mentioned is so-called cat o' nine tails, which is a nine-tailed whip that sometimes has metal on the end of it. Even just a really fast whip in something like 10 lashings can take a lot of skin off one's back. So the idea of 3,300 is extraordinary. And this is all for the amusement of the Duke and the Duchess. But another thing to keep in mind when you think about this is the very real consequences to the very fictional tale that Sancho put forward. Why did he first say that Dulcinea was a peasant woman? To avoid what? A scolding. Scoldings are terrible. None of us like them. 3,300 physical lashings by a whip, however, perhaps even worse. And Sancho is told that the moment that he finishes his very last whipping, Dulcinea will turn from a peasant woman into the beautiful Dulcinea that she is supposed to be. Of course, Don Quixote is extremely eager that Sancho do this, and one of the tensions between them until the very end of the text continues to be, Sancho, please get on with whipping yourself in order to restore Dulcinea to her original beauty. Sancho has no time limit on this, and Don Quixote cannot help him out by beating Sancho. Just something that I said that I would mention, right after this moment, we are treated to the spectacle of the wooden horse Clavileño, which both Don Quixote and Sancho sit on. When they are put onto this wooden horse, it is full of fireworks. They are told that they are flying through the air. The fireworks are lit, and the horse is sort of blown up. And this makes everybody laugh. The reason that they were riding on this horse is that the so-called Countess Trifaldi is one of these Dolorous Dueñas who shows up with a long beard, and because she has been cursed by a giant that must be reached through Clavileño and Don Quixote and Sancho. And in reaching this giant, they fight against him, and they will disenchant these Dolorous Dueñas. Don Quixote and Sancho fall off the horse, but they are told, because the Dueñas have disappeared at the end of this episode, that just putting forth the effort necessary in order to make it to this evil enchanting giant, they defeated him, and they successfully have brought to conclusion the episode of the Dolorous Dueñas. I told you I would say a little bit about some of these names and their fictionalized nature that are coming from the Duke and the Duchess, perhaps representing the fictional nature of these characters in an extra fictional way, how do we say this, a more meta-fictional way? Well, so Don Clavijo. Clavijo means peg. It's not a nobleman. He woos by wit and songs. Yes, this is part of the conceit that led to the Dueñas being cursed in the first place. Another one of these pastoral love stories. Antonomasia. I mentioned this, but didn't get it quite on the nose in seminar on Friday. Good thing I have my notes here. It's from the Greek, and it's in fact it's a literary term that we still have. It means to name by substitution. So to call somebody who is who frequently dates a Don Juan. Do all of you know the character Don Juan from historical literature? Don Juan, Don Giovanni, and Mozart. He's a nobleman who's known for seducing peasant women over and over and over and over again, and he really gets into it when he goes. This makes you probably think, oh, Mozart can't possibly be interesting. He's so. I'll give you a link of Don Giovanni, and the character who plays Don Giovanni in this, I promise you, is so handsome that you'll believe it. The guy he looks like what Don Giovanni would looks like Achilles or like a Brad Pitt, but it's amazing. And so you're watching this play, this opera about this man who can seduce anyone. And so you're like, I don't know. But he does a pretty good job. And so he's wearing a wig too. So his costumers do a good job too. But what he does is he goes, he's constantly seducing women, which one hears during the course of the opera. But he goes to a woman who is about to be married at her wedding ceremony. He takes her away from the wedding ceremony and her husband, and they try and make him be cool with it. And that really gets him into, that's just a bridge too far, as it were. So to name by a substitution, to call somebody a Don Juan or a real rake or something like that is antonomasia. Trifaldi, three skirts. Bruno. Mala in Latin means evil in the plural nominative or accusative. Bruno, dark as well. So dark evil. So that even the names themselves that the Duke and the Duchess come up with in their subterfuge-esque episodes reveal the fictional or the fictionality of what they are representing in front of Don Quixote. And like I said, the voyage of Clavileño, which is the name of the wooden horse with the peg on its front, which serves as its reins. These Dolorous Dueñas can only be saved and have their terrible beards removed by Don Quixote and Sancho riding a magical horse who flies through the sky. At the end of their journey through the sky, Sancho claims, this is probably the last thing that I'm really going to be able to touch on. At the end of this journey, which we know from the Duke and the Duchess's perspective lasts some seconds, maybe a couple minutes, Sancho then claims that he had a phantasmagoric experience and that he saw that they were so close to the stars that he saw the Pleiades. The Pleiades are a constant constellation that are mentioned even as far back as Homer. And that amongst them, he saw all the goats in the Pleiades. He saw at least 6 of them. He saw blue ones, green ones, and red ones. He was very curious. Very curious. Let me see if I have it right here on this. And so he says this to the Duke and the Duchess and everybody around. And Don Quixote leans over to him. What does Don Quixote say to Sancho? Sancho, just as you want people, this actually has a page number, so different translation here. Just as you want people to believe what you have seen in the sky, I want you to believe what I saw in of Montesinos. I give you all these quotes to blow open the question of who is telling the truth and who is lying. Is Don Quixote telling the truth about the cave of Montesinos? And is Sancho lying? Is Don Quixote deluded? Is Sancho correct? To think that Don Quixote is in error and Don Quixote is simply in error? Sancho has admitted that he knows that Don Quixote is mad, that he can use this madness against Don Quixote to get what he wants. He then gives us a story that only Sancho saw what he saw, and then he claims to have seen what he saw. Did Sancho actually see what he claimed to see? Or is he again lying like Don Quixote? Is he lying while Don Quixote was in error? And what does it mean for Don Quixote to say to Sancho, just as you wish for the Duke and the Duchess to believe what you saw in the sky, so do I believe, or so do I want you to believe what I saw in the cave. Who is lying? Who is telling the truth? Who is deluded? Who is in error? And that's all we have time for today. All right.